All right, guys, join me in welcoming Nina Menkes and Laura Polk. We can keep this kind of casual, talk about many subjects, of course, since we have a lot of different things we could discuss. But maybe to begin with, Laura, can you tell us a little bit about your relationship with Amy and how this book, I guess, originated?
I met Amy in 2010, and I believe we just met from going to like film forum screenings and being, active participants in going to all these screenings around town, much like how I met Jordan and many of you as well. And because I was at UCLA, we had the UCLA connection, and Amy needed an assistant, and I think it was just an affinity. We hit it off and had a lot in common and loved discussing films. And so I worked as her assistant for years, kind of between like 2012 and 2015, 16, on and off. And at the time, I helped her with different shoots, but I also was working very actively to get more screenings of her films and trying to get her into more festivals. So part of the reason I wrote this book is there's a sadness and a lament for me that I was very young when I was working for her, and I was not maybe super connected at the time, and I was kind of learning the ropes myself. So, it's like I wish I could have done more for her than I maybe was capable as a young, film grad. So I was really happy to kind of both write the book and have my personal reflections on that time and kind of how I was viewing the era of film as a physical, tangible medium, but then also I loved the idea that it was a way to bring more exposure to her work.
And the book itself is both kind of a reflection on your relationship with her, but also on celluloid and like as a tangible object. So the book is, resembles or looks like has affinities with celluloid objects. So I'm curious, can you talk about that idea and how you went about conceptualizing like the design of the book?
Yeah, so I was really interested in the idea because of my film background in like trying to translate that to print, and I like the idea that in filmmaking we think of shots or frame by frame, and so I got really interested in this concept of like, oh, what if we think of a page of a book like a frame, and kind of breaking it down into that kind of unit. And I also just wanted to make something that was a beautiful, tangible object, which felt like the right kind of choice when we're talking about, material, tangible art making and the physical medium of film. So it was, I thought it was something I had also never really seen before, is like this art book where it kind of makes you feel like you're in a darkened theater. And so I wanted to have that experience, even though it's funny when you're reading, you're usually by yourself and you're like in the book yourself, but so much of that time, and even how I met Amy and like my fondness for those days was very much about the experience of being in the cinema together. Now with streaming, it's I think we're viewing things maybe more in more isolated ways, but so much of that time for me was about like running into people in the physical space of the theater, and also just like the joy and sometimes frustrations of being in an audience. And like there's lots of jokes about like, oh, the person at the New Beverly who like always brought like a full meal and like had a plastic bag they were like constantly opening during quiet scenes, or like great experiences. Gavin and I actually went and saw Triangle of Sadness. I think that was like one of like the early like return to the theater experiences I had, and it was a packed house and people's like roaring laughter at scenes was just like, you don't get that at home. It's a very different experience.
About your film, it was, like I said, your second movie. Was this also made while you were at UCLA, or you was? Okay. Can you talk about those early years of making films? And I'm curious, just like as a career, was it something you like, when you were making these early works, were you already like set on this being your future as a film artist? Or I'm just curious like how you had thought about your career at that point.
Yeah, well, let me just say, like, it's quite nostalgic to see Annie's film, which I've seen before, because I recognize probably 30% of those people from the halls of UCLA. Yeah, I came to UCLA in the early 80s to the UCLA Film School, and the way it was structured there is your first film is a Super 8 film. That was called Project 1, and then there was Project 2 and Project 3 and Thesis. So The Great Sadness of Zohara was my Project 2. But my Project 1 was already, I had the experience of shooting it and editing it and doing the sound, and I knew right away, like I had come home and it was my vocation and it was my spiritual and artistic path. That was clear to me from the first second, and it took about 30 years to get discouraged.
This is your first film that like directly deals with kind of your Jewish heritage. It's something that thematically crops up more prominently in some films than others, but it's like a constant in your work. Can you talk about that, conceptualizing this film and wanting to go to Jerusalem and shoot this film, just like spiritually or just like personally to you? Like what inspired that?
Yeah, it's kind of sort of long and complicated, but I had seen a number of films where a person from the third world, like African person, comes to Europe. It seemed like I had seen quite a few of those. And I wanted to do something where it's like a reverse of that. And also, I had been influenced, like George Lucas and other people, by Joseph Campbell's book, Hero of a Thousand Faces, I think it's called, where he talks about this, traditional mythic structure where the hero, male hero, leaves home, goes into foreign lands, grabs the treasure, and then goes back home and is crowned king. And this structure, Joseph Campbell documented in cultures all around the world, and that's why he called it Hero of a Thousand Faces. So I was like, I wanted to do that too, but I cast my sister, who I had already made one Super 8 film with, and it was very powerful. And my family's from Israel originally, and so I had the idea of this Jewish girl going into the quote-unquote other side, which for someone from an Israeli background, the big fat other is the Arab world. So I wanted her to go into the Arab world and then go on this quest, and then she was supposed to come home and it was supposed to be victorious, because I had read that book, and that's what's supposed to happen. So we set out, and it was just, like I said, me and her on camera. And we traveled down to Morocco. My idea was, try to do the short form of this, but my idea was to start in Morocco and go all the way east along North Africa, and then end up in Jerusalem for this great homecoming that was in my mind. When we got to Morocco, it turned out you couldn't go east because there was a war with the neighboring country, which I think was Algeria. So we sort of traveled through Morocco, and then we flew to Cairo because you couldn't go overland, and then we went overland from Cairo up to Jerusalem, stay with my family, and I wanted to go out. First we shot the beginning, And then I wanted to shoot the end, which was supposed to be victorious, and I went out with Tinka and the camera, and I kept trying to get these victorious shots. And I just couldn't get a shot because I work completely intuitively, so I just put up the camera, Tinka and Dome of the Rock. No, and it's just like, everything felt just completely wrong. I couldn't shoot. We went back to my aunt's house, and the next morning I woke up and I was like, oh, the end is not victorious. And then I went out and shot the end with Tinka the next day. And later I read some texts about women's quest narratives, because at that point in time there were no women's quest movies. But there was fiction, women's quest fiction, and this article that I found said, in women's quest fiction, you often have the heroine going on an arduous quest, but when she returns home, her labors are unrecognized, and she's reaccommodated to her secondary status. So here I was 22 or 23, I don't know when I made that film, and I had done that completely intuitively. I hadn't thought it out as a political statement or anything, but that hero of 1,000 faces turned out to not be relevant if you're a woman. And, so the film in a way was, very, very intuitive about a spiritual and, political, whatever. I mean, there are a lot of aspects to it, but, it also ended up to be true for me as a filmmaker, because I felt like, well, people are going to see this film and I'm going to immediately get, a lot of money, and I'm going to be able to make another film, because obviously it's great. And, it was just an endless struggle, which has not resolved until today.
Well, we paired these films because LA female film artists, but in my futile attempt to kind of draw some connections between the films, they're not very similar formally or stylistically, but I guess you could say they're both portraits of a sort. Amy's film is like a literal portrait film, more figural and gestural, but yours may be like a psychological or existential portrait, which is something maybe you could describe as all your films kind of being sort of like that. So I'm curious, do you think of your films as kind of being portrait films of the sort, or no?
Well, along the lines of this, hero of 1,000 faces, and my alternative trajectory, the films, when, I work completely intuitively, so I never kind of think it out, but I realized when I kind of look back on my films at a certain point that the films themselves, and I don't want to take away, Laura, from your book, and because it's a bit complicated, but my films as a sequence, they actually track this so-called hero's journey from the other side, from the side of the abject feminine. So first, Great Sentence of Zohara, she tries to go on this quest, and she's reaccommodated to secondary status. So my next film, Magdalena Viraga, takes place entirely in the so-called underworld. So it's really the people, the hero, if you think about that hero's quest, it's a prototype of imperialist and sexist exploitation. The guy leaves home, goes into unknown lands, steals their treasure, gets their princess, goes home, and is crowned king. That's the perfect outline of imperialist conquest, and it's kind of amazing that that's considered the narrative. So my films track this character, which was played for a long time by my sister Tinka, who goes on a very different kind of quest. And that quest, in terms of my first 5 films, sort of ends in a way at the bottom. I guess it's called the nadir. Is that the bottom, the apex thing? The bottom of that descent into, I guess, hell is my film, The Bloody Child, where it's complete, I don't know how many people here know my work, but it's complete fragmentation of a psyche and complete suicidal kind of energy as this woman comes in contact with, increasingly contact with patriarchal violence and stuff like that. But so it's a portrait, not so much of a, an individual person, but you could say, this journey of the abject feminine, which was very much my own journey. And then there is kind of a bit of a coming out with my films Phantom Love. And anyway, it's a long story, the process, but it does track, this alternative journey that is completely different than the so-called hero's classic itinerary.
Sure.
I love that. I will also say when I was writing my book that I was thinking a lot about feminine. My book's not very narrative, so I guess I can't say narrative, but that was also why I was really interested in having so much black space on the page, because I thought, to me, that felt like a rightful nod of kind of like what you're saying. It's not about like going out and like filling up the absence, in quotes, but it was about like leaving a lot of space for both the reader and just like holding that space that I kind of associate more with femininity. And the fact also, I'm really interested in kind of capturing grief as well, and I think about that a lot in terms of how we think of like narratives where it's like you're supposed to be strong and you're supposed to go out and like kind of conquer, and it kind of feels to me like a rebellion against that of like, no, I'm just gonna sit with my grief and kind of be very internal, and instead of like projecting outward, actually allow kind of the self to fill up space inside. And it just seemed like the right kind of needed thing that we don't see all the time, right? It's like with a lot of grief, it's like overcoming grief, right? Or like getting onto the other side of it. But kind of like you're saying with your films, it's like maybe just not seeing it as something to kind of conquer or get over, but just allowing it to kind of be as well.
Laura, maybe you can lend some insight into, you've probably seen more of Amy's films than the average person. So can you talk about this film maybe in context of her body of work where it sits? I don't know if you feel like you could do that or not, or if you had any experiences talking to Amy about this particular film and her thoughts on it. I'm just curious.
Yeah, unfortunately, because it was so much before I started working with her, she told me a little bit about falling lessons, but what I mainly think about with this film in the context of conversations I had with her and other films that I've seen is I think she was really, or what I especially value about her work is that you get so much relationality between people and animals and plants. So also going back to this like hero's journey where it's like very much like the human and like conquering the land. I think both the way she lived her life, but then I think we see in her films, you see like a much more kind of whole or holistic view of life where it's not just like people, it feels very non-hierarchical to me. And so that's what I tend to be excited by. One of the things I'm very excited by with her work and really value is that it feels like this like whole gamut of experience and kind of life in all its forms. And also with this film, also that there's so much value on music and other arts. So it's also just like, it feels very like encompassing and very wide ranging in that way.
Yeah. Nina, for one other slight connection, both the films have very intense sound mixes or sound design. Can you talk about the layering of sounds and voices in your film and what you were going for there? There's like a steady drone almost in the film. I'm just
Yeah.
curious where that idea came from.
Well, I shot the film entirely silent, and I worked on the editing for a long time, and then I felt like I had a cut of the film that I thought was great, which was that cut, 40 minutes, and then I had no idea what to do with the sound. I was like, what do I do with the sound? I didn't know what to do, and I started playing with different sounds. Just, I think it took 6 months. I would go to UCLA in the morning and try sounds, all day long. No. I remember, I mean, when I went to UCLA, it was like a hippie school. It was really, really different than how it is now. It was really great. Nobody ever, if you knew what you wanted to do, which was me, then you could just do it, and no one would bother you. But, I remember one of the teachers, because it was always like just independent study. I said, well, I haven't accomplished anything else all quarter. I can't say I did anything, because all I had done was try sounds that failed. And he said, and I remember, because I later passed this on to my students, he said, well, by trying things that didn't work, you learn about your film, which was true. So anyway, I remember the first day when I found a sound that was right, which was in Tangier when she's going through those corridors, and it was the Luciano Berio experimental woman singer, and I was like, oh my God, this is great. It sort of takes I always feel like when sound works, it's 1 + 1 is 20, it's like that. So once I sort of found one sound that worked, which was the Berio woman singing in those Tangier streets, then I just went and I found the sound that felt right for every single shot, but I didn't have any voiceover. And after that, I was like, I have to give more, there has to be another layer of meaning, or the meaning that I know is in the film, but sort of bring it a little bit up, And I was reading a lot of Job in the Old Testament, and I took the idea that she's a seeker, and I was playing with voiceover, and I couldn't decide whether I should say they call her Zohara. The first line is they call her Zohara, or they call me Zohara. I couldn't decide, and one day when I was playing with, it was like in the old days on flatbeds, I had two sounds running, and I had both the they call her, they call me, and they were running at the same time, and I was like, oh, that's it, So the film really plays a lot with the idea that the camera, and this is, some of you may have seen my most recent film, Brainwashed. So really, before any of these ideas were conscious, the way it's articulated in my recent work, where it's hyper conscious and articulated, but the idea of the main female character, and the camera is following her, watching her, pushing her. Is the camera sort of God? Who's the camera, and what is the relationship between this female character and the camera? And at the end, she confronts and looks back at the camera, and all of those things were done, both sound and picture, on an intuitive level that I can look back on it now and say, oh, well, really, without having much, or rather with having zero education around theory or anything like that, I was, feeling those issues, even though the film is about, a spiritual seeker and is connected to the Middle East, and really has nothing to do with feminist theory in any way, but those questions are in the film too.
Does anyone have any questions, actually? Anyone? Sure, Pat.
I'm just, this is something more maybe I'm thinking, but both films had a little bit of an underlying kind of almost like sensibility to him. And I mean, I recognize, of course, like Alex Cox and Tom Richards and little classmates in Amy's film, but also in Nina's film, of course, not just the cutting of the hair and stuff, but kind of there was, you know, I don't know if that was part of the time period. There's also music in the films, but in Amy's film, yeah, especially it's kind of punkish. Curious if you guys were influenced by punk, like if that was something that was figured somehow into Amy's work. I don't know if you can speak for that, and Nina's work, especially early on.
Well, I don't know about Amy.
Yeah, Amy was really influenced by music and punk. She's also really into jazz too. So I just think there's a lot of music and other arts like very much infuse her filmmaking.
Yeah, I would think, I think, I mean, I don't know about punk per se, but certainly Tinka herself had played with putting different colors on her hair, and it just seemed like a good symbol for this, you know, this religious woman who's just, you know, sort of completely wearing this, like uniform, and has to cover up and everything, to have the hair kind of poke out and be blue, or, you know, when she first takes off her scarf and she has blonde hair. So it's sort of a little bit a sense of, you know, that she has some other energy there. I don't know if it was punk per se, but it was influenced by the way that Tinka used to play with her hair, actually, in real life. So.
There was one other one. Yeah.
Yeah, I had a question for Nina. I think the fact that you made this with your sister, and you were saying that the two of you were traveling, and it was really just you two and the camera, and watching it, like there's a lot of like emotionality with her as this isolated female figure. And I have a close relationship with my sister, and I've traveled with her, and I was just curious about the dynamic of like being in those spaces with her, and maybe you guys could really turn it off when the camera cut, but it just was like, I was thinking about what that might have been like to make this like really potent imagery and like artwork with your sister, like putting her in those spaces. That makes sense.
Yeah, well, it was very heavy, and it got more heavy with every film as we went along, until Tinka finally said, "See you later." It was a little too potent with the bloody child, but I think that you know, we had a very, very deep kind of telepathic understanding, and for whatever reason, because the way we ended up, my first film, which was the Super 8, so-called Project One that they did at UCLA, I had actually cast two women to be in this film, and one was supposed to be her, and they hadn't shown up, and I was shooting in my mother's house, and I asked Tinka to do it because she was there, and when we saw the rushes, we were like, oh my God, because I mean, she didn't know, and I didn't know that she was like an incredible performer, and I didn't know that I was a great cinematographer. And then there is this thing that happened between us that was also kind of unexpected, which was, I don't really know, sometimes I think, I'm clearly the writer, director, and cinematographer of my films, but Tinka really, she would always take everything to this level that I could never have really dreamed of, usually like deeper and almost just because of who she is and, how she feels. I don't really know how to describe her what she does as a performer. But, you know, so I feel like whatever she did, I was there to capture it. So I would have an idea of something, but then she would always sort of take it to another level. But again, the films, you know, as I explained, they sort of went from, you know, this original journey, and they got like kind of darker and darker and darker all the way till The Bloody Child, and then Tinka just didn't want to continue. It was too much for her because she really doesn't just. I mean, actors have to know how to like go there and come out, and she just was like she would so go there that it was almost like a not acting, and it was too much. So that's of course why she's great, but it was a little hard on her.
Laura, can you tell us about the writing process and coming to the decision to maybe take like a more poetic approach rather than I don't know, what fictive route or like a biographical route? I'm just curious, like the actual writing process for you and how that developed, I guess.
Yeah, I wrote the book extremely quickly, and it was just after Amy died, it was just like, came out of me. It was very much not like a conscious, like, oh, I'm going to write a book about this and capture it. It was just, I think, just very, like, that was my reaction, was to try to capture things in words. And something I've thought of a lot is because we spent so much time with experimental film, and that was such a big part of my world, is that I think in experimental, I mean, it's kind of weird to generalize experimental film, but there's a lot more films that maybe don't have sound, or there's text on the screen, or I was also watching a lot of international cinema, so I was thinking a lot about how I was actually reading a lot in the theater because there's people experimenting with text and image, or subtitles, and so I think that was also why it felt like the right form to kind of have these snippets of text and in a more poetic form, because it also, to me, was this similar style and flavor to watching experimental films where you're actually reading quite a bit sometimes.
We can maybe do one more if someone has a question. If not, I was curious, Nina, you mentioned some of the narrative inspirations for the film, and but what movies were you watching at that point? Do you remember, like, that inspired you to first make movies? Do you recall?
Well, I always think that I was saved because my mother didn't have a TV. So I grew up without a TV, and of course when I grew up there was no internet and no video stores. So I didn't see that many films, but I grew up in Berkeley, so I would go to the Pacific Film Archive. I saw some Werner Herzog, and then in high school I saw some. I took like some film classes, and the films that really impacted me were Antonioni, Red Desert, and Last Year in Marienbad. The Conformist really affected me, although when I saw it later I thought it was terrible. Not really like American films at all, and not American experimental films I had like no contact with until like much later. And then, after I was in film school, I saw, I guess, Jean Dielman. I saw in like late 80s, Tarkovsky.
I mean, yeah, that's interesting. Like, I'm sure people watch your movies and think like you may have liked Ackerman films, but you probably hadn't even seen them, I guess.
No, not until after Magdalena Viraga. Yeah, like late 80s, I saw Jean Dielman, and I was like, wow.
You can see Red Desert today, that's for sure. Well, if there's no more questions, I guess we can wrap and take this to the lobby. But yeah, join me in thanking Nina and Laura.
Thank you.
Of course. And still some books out there. And Yeah, so thank you guys for coming, and we'll see you hopefully in January. Thank you.